he kind of came out not so orthodox on sustainable food, but he said, eat around the outside of a grocery store, but whatever you do, eat what you want to eat as long as you've made it yourself. If you want to make yourself a whole chocolate cake and eat that, if you've made it yourself, done.
I did not read that part of the book.
And so I thought about that today when I was eating chocolate cake for lunch.
Hey, this is Joshua. In today's video blog, we are going to go to my class at MCAD, where the designer and educator and printmaker and interesting dude all around, Dan Ibarra, came to talk to my class or to do a Q&A. If you've heard of Dan, it's a good chance it's because he was a founding partner of Aesthetic Apparatus, who made a bazillion posters. He left in 2016 after 17 years to go in a different direction, and now he's starting a new agency, does his printmaking, and is in a kind of deep concerted effort to really think through the creative process and how it works. I think it's a really interesting talk. Dan is one of those people that when he gets started, he just goes and he says smart, interesting stuff the whole time. So I think you're in for a treat. I hope you enjoy this.
But I also have a newfound favorite food, which when you said peanut butter and cheese is what I think maybe the mindset that I was in, that I have now discovered peanut butter and pickle sandwiches. Peanut butter and dill pickle.
I've heard of it.
I swear.
It sounds
Give it a
awesome.
try. I know. It sounds like a joke on like pregnant food, but it's like crisp and green and rich and nutty and recommended.
I'm not going to try it.
All right.
I'm going to be close-minded on that.
Great.
All right, I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and
Okay.
then this is how it's going to work.
Oh.
We're going to talk about Dan's work in reverse chronological order, so that if we get cut short, the only stuff we miss out on is the nostalgic stuff.
That's good.
That's my logic.
That's good.
All right, so let's get into the very first thing. What is your creative process like today when you start a project?
I think it depends on the project, but I'm glad that you're starting there because I'm going to take a step out from that, because I think the thread that may come up again and again is my curiosity with the creative process as this amorphous, gelatinous thing that we have. I am infatuated with it because I don't understand it, and I've spent a lot of time trying to understand it and seeing it come through and seeing surprise and serendipity and chaos and iteration and all the things that create ideas. My current interest is trying to unpack the fundamentals of creative process. My creative process is a lot of, it's almost like a Ouija board. That magic of having something exit your body and not necessarily knowing what it is or why you're doing it until you suddenly know. And I think for me, I really enjoy the creative process as a concept because I am a very rational, methodical, and strategic graphic designer, which makes coming up with new ideas really hard. And so I've always built a lot of tools and gotten a lot of inspiration from the things that surprise me, the things that I can't control that have made new ideas. And I've become really interested in the creative process, not as a means of getting to a resolution, but a means of making enough questions to find new resolutions. I see the human mind as a really shitty creative tool. I think we're a success as a species because we solve problems really well and we make connections really well, and that's why we are the way that we are, because we can solve these really unrelated problems and rationalize them and make connections and make new ideas. The problem is that we're really bad at taking really different things and sticking them together. They get stuck together for us in front of us, and we're there to say, like, oh yeah, pickles and peanut butter. I'm going to stick that together. But I don't think that any necessarily rational human mind can think of a creative idea. So that's why I have gone down this route of trying to unpack the fundamentals of creative process. And this is my first stab of these 4 categories of generate, connect, destroy, and adapt, and then all the subgroups of this that are techniques, methodologies for basically placing our mind in an uncomfortable place and sticking things together that shouldn't be stuck together, so that we can make a really fertile ground to connect and rationalize. And so my creative process is often observing a lot of curiosity. This used to say research, but I think I changed that to curiosity, because research is not, I've never researched anything. I've gotten really curious about beekeeping for my client, and I've gotten really curious about kombucha for another client, and I've gotten really curious about Korean craft culture for another client. But it's never been research, it's been something that I'm curious and I'm delving into. So I observe a lot of curiosity, and then my sketching is typically improvisational. I should have brought a sketchbook. I don't actually sketch to draw anything. I sketch to make lines and shapes that don't make sense. I do the same thing when I'm designing. I hate to design with an idea already in my head and then try and make it work on the computer. I actually tend to prefer to just start physically moving things around. And then I know that my rational mind, with all my curiosity about kombucha as an example, there was a project that I worked on for my client Ann Kim, which was about Korean street culture and her grandmother's kitchen in the 70s. And so I had to dive down into, say, the dark web of Pinterest, into 70s kitchens and look at all this stoneware from horrible 70s stoneware, and then go and observe a bunch of curiosity about what Korean street culture looks like, which led me to bojagi quilts, which are these very lopsided quilted patterns. And I combined 70s wallpaper, kitchen wallpaper, with bojagi quilts into this texture that we used for Young Joni, Ann Kim's restaurant. I tend to really prefer contrast, and so I try to find ideas that don't tend to live together very well. Peanut butter and pickles, I guess.
Do you find that that's typically a thing where, like, a methodical thing, or like a flash of insight type thing, like, oh shit, this and this? Or is it more like lists and being like, well, what about this and this, or what about this and this?
Process-wise, for me, it's word making. So I write words faster than I draw pictures. So I'll typically just write words, whatever word comes to me. So it is literally an improvisation of language. Let's say I'm working on, a Young Joni project, and I'm just writing words, and I come up with, bubble gum. And suddenly my rational mind is there to make sense of bubble gum and Korean street culture. It didn't happen, but I'm always there. Our minds are always there to connect. And I trust that my rational problem-solving mind will be there for when two really disparate things come up in my creative process and they just get stuck together immediately. I hate a conscious creative process. I much more prefer a trust fall of creative process. So most recently, it comes from a step that I took to restart my own process. So my outcomes for the most part have been wholly digital. Whether I've been making something like this, these posters that I did for 20 years, or this, everything here was found image, collage, all digital collage, digital typography. As a printmaker and as a typographer and as an illustrator and as a graphic designer, I felt like I'd kind of done everything that I wanted to do just for my own personal self. So I I have a discipline that is in one part very much a strategic graphic design branding discipline, and I have a discipline that's also very much a fine art discipline, which really embraces some of these more abstract parts of the creative process. So anyway, I had wanted to paint for a long time, which is just such a fucking cliche at this point. Every graphic designer gets back into painting, but I was definitely a failed painter. Have you already? I don't know what that is. Well, it's because we grow tired of these tools that don't surprise us anymore. We can't get some of the most amazing parts of a digital design discipline is when you don't know the tool very well, and creative process takes over, and you make a mistake, or you get frustrated with it, and something turns the wrong color, or gets on top of something, and suddenly you've made something surprising and new and fresh. And if you've been working with that same tool for 20 years, it's not new and fresh. It does exactly what you want to do. So it's hard to surprise yourself. I started as a failed painter in high school, so I have a little bit of an excuse to go back to it. But I really like typography, and so I finally found some lettering brushes, and I started lettering to just make shapes, to just so I've kept every single test sheet that I've done. This is just from a sketchbook that I started lettering in. Just like making lines, trying to make shapes, and I get bored easily, so I can't just do that all day. So I start making letters and putting another letter, like, oh, I gotta practice my U's, so I'm just gonna make some U's, and then I'm gonna make an N, and then suddenly, without fail, my mind starts rationalizing it, and I form words, and words start coming to the surface. And so I've spent a lot of time doing this kind of thing, just trying to teach myself how to letter, teaching myself how to use these brushes, but also in this process, and this is where the Ouija board comes in, not anticipating what letter comes next. And literally painting words before I know what I'm painting. So these are just some scraps of lettering practice, and I installed all of these in a show recently at Augsburg that I called Garnish, which I liked for, again, it's contrast, garnish as a means of decorating food, and garnish as a means of taking what's left of you financially. So, this is me continuing to play and make shapes. And yes, these say something now, but when I started writing them, they didn't say anything. This says Ham's stand just because that's what my hand made. This says, yes, I do love saying it. Mono squibble, I have no idea. But it's almost like I was a 2-year-old learning a language, right? Something like that, where words come out making sense at the beginning and then they just fall apart in the middle. That happened a lot. This is a great example of kind of a little bit more of an advanced stage. I honestly didn't mean to write parts of a whole on here, and I think I only knew I was writing parts of a whole when I got to the A. Literally every letter just came out like a Ouija board. And again, my rational mind makes sense of this. There are things excluded. I can explain this with all kinds of creative philosophy of the story that is told with this typography and this image, compositionally or narratively. And so this work has led me to new printmaking processes. So something like this, which is all hand painted and hand cut paper stencil. I mean, so this is very much like, this is printmaking about the creative process, and it's lettering about the creative process. This is, I'm not too concerned about you being able to read this, but this says notional recession, like lack of ideas.
Aaron's question.
Yes.
Doing this free form kind of painting type exploration, do you feel like that helps or has an effect on your type work in actual design?
This is going to sound like really egotistical, and I apologize. I'm a very capable typographer digitally, so this is a way of hijacking my comfort and capability as a digital typographer to forget it all and try and relearn how to make letter forms. I think what it does is it maybe helps me create more plastic typography. So create letter forms that don't necessarily fall along such a rigid international style structure that the computer is made for. I'm also really, I don't know what's going to happen with this, but I'm really obsessed with this idea that we still exist within a modernist philosophy and that computers are also tools of a modernist philosophy. And if we had maybe existed under a different creative philosophy of making, that computers would behave differently. Like right? Computers are made perfectly for creating international style. Like it's the easiest thing to make on a computer.
Yeah, there's one of the Willie Kuhn's books, there's this graph that shows every single decision your software makes for you when you open it. And it's like a list of, like if it was probably designed in Quark era, but it's the same thing. You open InDesign up, and InDesign decides your page size, your margins, your gutter, your bleed, your default font, the size, the lighting, like everything out of the box. And you don't realize how many decisions it's making for you right off the bat that you actually have to manually override.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it's like a perfect illustration of that. Was this play-oriented work? Is that always part of your creative practice, or is that a thing you picked up at some point?
It's something I picked up from the printmaking process. So you might recognize some of the elements in your hands in this print. This is a make-ready or test print, but this is garbage, right? This is just an outcome of the printmaking process. But it also has an inherent beauty and surprise to it because there is a creative process to the printmaking process, which leads to and yields unanticipated outcomes. Ideas brought together that wouldn't have been brought together before because our rational mind simply couldn't have conceived of it. And so for me, test prints were a huge inspiration and kind of the origin of my curiosity about creative process, because here's this piece of trash, this reject from the printmaking process that has made something as or more beautiful than the original intended artwork. And so what happened here? Why does this excite me so much, even though it has none of the work that went into making the print that's part of it? Because there's something magical here that can't necessarily be completely perfectly put together, that surprises us, that invokes some core identity of the creative process. And because we work so hard to rationalize it, and we can't maybe, it's delicious for our mind. All those moments where you just can't control the tool perfectly by design are all those moments when the greatest ideas come out, because you had to give up, you had to let go of the reins a little bit and surprise yourself and have the process lead you a bit of the way. It begins to feel almost spiritual to me in some sense, because literally something is guiding my hand as I make these letters, and I don't know where it goes, but I trust that when it's done, something will be there. I haven't quite figured out the right language to describe it yet. There's a lot of that for me. There's a lot of creative process that is deeply interesting to me, and I'm not quite sure where that goes. I just use acrylic ink. Some of that's India ink. For the longest time, I was trying to figure out how to make my films, my stencils, my photo stencils with my brushes. And so I found the right consistency of acrylic ink, which is like really thin yogurt. And I'm hand lettering onto marker paper and then throwing canola oil on that marker paper and then exposing that as my film for a lot of this. And sometimes I'm, in that example of the notional recession, I'm actually cutting up those pieces of paper and placing them on different films. And so I'm like lettering and collaging and cutting paper and trying to be as analog as I possibly can to surprise myself. And like relearn a tool.
I want to jump back to
Yeah.
like graphic design for a second.
Okay, great.
So when you're doing a project now, there's typically this curiosity phase. Which I'm just going to call research because it makes sense to me.
Okay, great.
So you go through this research phase
Yeah.
and kind of like finding things that are interesting to you, running down these rabbit holes and starting to jam stuff together. Or seeing like a possibility for two things to live together. Has that always been your design process?
I think for the longest time I thought that I needed to hunt down an idea. So the analogy that I've stuck with lately is that in my younger days I tried to hunt down ideas like tigers, like tracking them, seeing if I could find little tidbits along the way, broken branches off in the distance. But now what I've done is I try and hunt down ideas like deer. And I just sit and I wait for them to come to me. If I could just have gone back and trusted in sketching to not come up with ideas, but sketching to just make shapes and then be ready for something to show up, I probably could have saved myself so many hours. I also don't know if I necessarily would have been able to go back and do that. So this is the part of the process that I don't know. That maybe I've also become so acclimated to the plasticity of my creative process that I think it's easy, but maybe it's really hard. Maybe it's really hard to just write words and improvise and not know what word comes next. Maybe it's really hard to just draw on a whiteboard until something comes, some oblique idea comes through and I can make sense of it. I don't know because I can't go back, but for me it seems easy.
Yeah. I think, like in terms of what we're doing in this class, like that's the total and complete opposite of what we're doing, right? Not because what we're doing is the right way to do it, just because what we're doing is one way to do it. And if you're chasing after ideas, you need to have a way to make those ideas come to you. That's, like if you're gonna go work in an agency, you can't sit around and draw shapes. You can't, you know what I mean?
I think it's actually more efficient than sitting and trying to consciously hunt down an idea.
So I sort of agree with you, but I
Okay.
think the thing in general is like, I think that like, you can make ideas happen in a fairly rational way and get to interesting ideas through systems. And then you can also work in other ways. And one of the important things is to figure out which are the ways that work for you. And then like grab the bits and pieces so that you can put it together. So not that it's either or, but that it's like a yes and kind of situation. But
Sure.
the goal being like, the drawing shapes thing might immediately register as like, I should try that. But then that might work with this other kind of like methodical systems approach to research or ideation. But understanding that both are options, I think, and
Yeah.
understanding the context.
Yes. I would argue that these are also systems, and that any system that you build lives within the context of a creative process. So the biggest one is on this, they're all labeled in the same hierarchy, but really probably I'd put constraint maybe towards the top. And so when you're building, I don't know what system you use for your creative process, but I imagine it has something to do with constraints and limitations, and I use that fairly often. That curiosity builds in constraints, and then those constraints become the fencing around where all my ideas can come from. And then I start to explore that smaller area to find the ideas at the outer edges that can be new and surprising.
And one follow-up question, so you're talking about like, you don't know that you could take what you know today and apply it to, say, 25-year-old Dan.
Yeah.
And do you think like that's in large part because of like the mindset? Because like I don't know that I could take what I know now and go back in time to like when I was at MCAD And it totally, for me, would be the right way to work, but I don't know if I'd be able to like let go enough. Because I think for me, it's like really critical not to give a fuck. But I gave a fuck too much when I was like 25 or 26. And I think that's like one of the big things that's like hard for me. Like, because I kind of wish that I could have been like, oh, I wish I had a time machine so I could jump forward, figure this shit out, and go back and do this the right way. But I think there's like a mindset thing that you kind of have to maybe go through in order to let go enough to where like suddenly you can get a lot better.
I don't know if you have to go through it as much as you're indoctrinated into it for 20 years. And then, you know, at 18, when you leave grade school and you've been acclimated into this goal-oriented educational philosophy, it's really hard to come into something for yourself or without having to find an answer. I think that a lot of times you try looking for the answer, and I don't think that looking for the answer is how to get there. Like, I don't like to go in a straight line, and I don't think that's the best way to get to a new idea.
How do you talk about your process with the clients?
Yeah.
Oh, I post-rationalize the decisions I've made. So internally, I do all that digging, and then I destroy it all and put it through the wood chipper and stuff it in a plastic bag and stick it in the trunk, and then I drive for a while and it figures itself out. But my client doesn't have to know that. When I get there, I can make sense of what that is, and my client can make sense of what that is. And I think that anyone who doesn't admit that they are rationalizing any creative decision that they make is kidding themselves. I think we all make abstract decisions, and then we're there to make sense of them. But I don't think that we need to tell, like, maybe we can tell the client that, no, I do. I communicate to my client that there's time. We have to take time to percolate ideas, to let them go, to let them mix. That's all part of that messy creative process of making ideas. So yeah, I'm not showing them all the asinine sketches and weird drawings that I'm making, or my word lists, because they don't need to see that, just like I don't need to see all their Excel spreadsheets to know that they're a reliable business person. I mean, I think that mistakes are a part of this process, and failure is a part of a creative process, and we can't get to anywhere new without it, but we can keep some of that to ourselves. Trust in ourselves that it's important.
So I wanted to ask you about having a mixed practice of education and design working and what that's like.
I mean, I have even a mixed practice now of graphic design, printmaking, lettering, and education, and they used to all live. My graphic design and my printmaking and my education at one point lived all under the same roof, and that felt good to have them all blend, because they do have some shared philosophy. But I am actually really enjoying slowly uncoupling them and having them have their own purpose and identity to them and approach, because I think that I really enjoy a robust branding project. I enjoy the strategy. I mean, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I really like to make a complex system hum. That's a lot of fun for me, and I can't just do that. So I now have actually even another name, which is coming back to Planet Design Company and Planet Propaganda. I had a creative director there, Kevin Wade, who was one of the founders of Planet Design Company. And we worked together on projects while I was there. And we kept in touch when I left Aesthetic Apparatus. He helped to nurture that discipline into a business. We kept in touch and kept in touch for 16 years, and he got burnt out. because he stayed and ran a huge agency, made a lot of money, and bent over backwards to do it. And just as I was leaving Aesthetic Apparatus and he was leaving Planet, we started becoming each other's creative therapists. And there was a point last summer where we realized, oh, we should just like work together again. And so as of this last fall, we've started a new studio. We're working on our first project now with Ann Kim on her new restaurant in South Minneapolis. So there's now another studio which is called Face of the Earth. And now there's Face of the Earth, which is, we're calling it a branding conservatory. And there's Thriving Concern, which I'm pivoting to my printmaking and artistic discipline, and Augsburg University, which is my educational practice, which is then also birthed from Schoolhouse, which was my studio-based educational practice. It was a studio-based community college, small, 12 students at a time. It was very progressive in terms of the education was led by the students, so whatever they needed to learn was where the curriculum went. I mean, you know, I'll be honest, I am in a huge transition in my creative practice. Things are breaking apart, and I'm trying to give them homes. So my printmaking practice and my educational practice broke apart when I left Aesthetic Apparatus. And my design practice and my printmaking practice broke apart when I started Thriving Concern, because I wanted to define a graphic design discipline without my artistic discipline.
I feel like now we have to explain, just in case no one
Yeah.
knows, was the rundown on Aesthetic Apparatus. Even though I was going to go in reverse chronological order, but it's kind of important because like most people don't quit a design job and then lose the printmaking, because most people's design job has nothing to do with printmaking.
Mm-hmm.
But like with Apparatus, it was like every single project almost.
Aesthetic Apparatus was a really interesting mix of the disciplines of myself and who would become my business partner, Michael Brzeski. We met within 6 months of each other at Planet Design Company. I had some screen printing knowledge, was not very good, and he had started a zine, and so he was really connected with the music industry, and I was connected with printmaking, and we fucking chocolate and peanut buttered that shit together into poster art. And I think the key to Aesthetic Apparatus's early success was that we were able to let it incubate. So my day job paid my way, and my free time was filled with the creative energy to make hundreds of posters. And Michael and I screen printed, we probably did a good 50 or 75 posters before we actually left Planet Design Company after a couple years and started Aesthetic Apparatus as our actual full-time studio. So the first success was that it didn't have to make any money for us for like 3 years. And from 1999 to 2002, our day jobs, which were working for large-scale clients. So at that time, my client was Jimmy John's. So if you go and buy a bag of chips, like that's still my work, which is kind of nice and also kind of uncomfortable at the same time because I am in conflict with that man's politics. But that was work that for 2 years I didn't have to really think about. I laid out the new college newspaper ad, and then at 5 o'clock I punched out and I started making posters down the street. And so I didn't have to inject a lot of creative energy into my job that paid me and bought ink and beer and paper and whatever else Aesthetic Apparatus needed. It also benefited from a new economic scheme, which was that all the posters were free for the client, but the fans paid for the posters. So we did all our posters for free for the clubs, and then we made more posters than the club needed. So the club needs 20 posters, all right, we're gonna make 120 posters. And then we're gonna show up at the show, band gets however many posters they want for free. Anyone who came to the show, here, buy a poster for $5. Anything that's left over goes up on a website, gets sold for 20 bucks. And even at $5, we're still making profit off of the materials of a screen printed poster. And so that economy blossomed. It was the perfect conjunction of like the death of music as an object and the birth of performance as the way that we really take our music in. And we were able to make objects that succinctly encapsulated this musical moment and got to replace CDs and albums as the physical object that you looked to when you thought of the music. I think that we were successful at that point. So we had already been around for a few years when Aesthetic Apparatus went full-time, and we moved up to St. Paul. We shared a house together for the first year, and it's funny, I have a friend, Eric Westra, who just did he sold off his poster collection to raise money for a children's artistic nonprofit. And he went back and he was trying to do a timeline of the first posters we had done together. And the first 10 posters we did with Eric Westra for First Avenue were within 2 months. So like every week there was a poster for First Avenue that we were like designing, printing, showing up, putting online, and just like hustling. And so we just made a lot of work. And so that was the other success, is that we just were able to make a ton of stuff. I think I got burnt out because like I said, I like large strategic ideas. So it's hard for me to come up with a new, innovative, interesting visual idea every week. That's a real challenge for me. Maybe it wouldn't be anymore. Maybe my process, because I'm thinking now about my process. At that point, I still had a process that was very much research, hate myself, more research, I'm an idiot, I don't know anything. Oh, a mistake happened. I got it, genius. And now I
Which is
understand.
super funny because it's like a rock poster.
Yes.
Like it didn't need all of that.
Oh, but it
No.
totally, yeah. For me, it totally did. It had to make sense for exactly everything. And also I thought that I had to, that was how I was always trying to track my prey and take it all in and find it amongst the weeds, and it was never there. And the success always came when I gave up. And I think that was the beginning of maybe understanding the creative process that works for me.
So you did Aesthetic Apparatus for 16 years. Like at what point were you like thinking I should leave?
When I really just wished I could teach. And I taught adjunct here for a number of years and stopped in 2009 when my daughter was born. And I really wanted to get back in the classroom. And so I just did it myself and started a class at the studio. And then it got really messy, just financially messy. I really wanted to keep pursuing that. And I think if my business partner had wanted to, we could have maybe done that together. But he's like non-format. Michael Bozeski is one of those people who you just sit him down in front of something and he can just start working. You can just start making something. But I can't tell you how many times I would walk by his monitor and be like, oh my gosh, Michael, that's amazing. What are you making? And his answer to me would be, I don't know.
That's amazing.
And like that, and that's, I think he was also a big inspiration to me because he didn't worry about what it meant yet. He could just make, and then he just trusted that it would come to the surface at some point.
Were the projects collaborative, like in the sense that you both worked on them? Or was it more like the studio was collaborative?
The studio was collaborative.
Okay.
The posters were rarely collaborative. The projects were semi-collaborative, mostly to the point of we're pitching our ideas together, and whoever's idea that they led on gets chosen leads the project.
So more like an agency?
Yeah.
Okay.
for all of my creative career, I've had two definitions. One is financial success, or maybe that, famous notoriety.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other one's like creative success. And you can make a ton of money and hate yourself. And you can make zero money and be the happiest person in the world. For a while, Aesthetic Apparatus was both of those to me. And it was amazing at that point. But then it became a practice that I was not creatively successful anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It was painful for me to do the work that was expected of us at that time, and I couldn't get Aesthetic Apparatus to the point where I was feeling like I was doing the work that I wanted to do. I think I was changing, and so I needed to change away from that identity. I wasn't that person anymore. And Schoolhouse was the beginning of that, and that decision to leave was to be able to start again.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm still starting. I left Aesthetic Apparatus in 2016, and I think after 3 years, and this is probably, actually, it's funny, I'm rebuilding this Thrive and Concern website, and I went back to some blog posts on the old Thrive and Concern website that are from like May 6th, 2016. So like literally 3 years ago, I'm just now starting.
What did you do right after that? Like once you were officially done?
I made this book. This was a project that I took with me. I wrote, designed, and illustrated Speedball's screen printing instructional manual, which I think I got paid $5,000 to do, and I spent easily $20,000 of time working on. So right out of the gate, I was already in the hole.
Nice, $4 an hour.
Yeah. And I'm really proud of this. It, for me, is a beginning of where I'd like to go. I like to write. I like language. I like to tell stories, even minute, momentary stories. On the subject of stories, actually, this is a great point. What I did was I tried to figure out my style.
Oh, okay, cool.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I don't have a style. If you look at this, none of this work looks like it came from the same person. My style started aesthetically as an ephemeralist, as a vernacular graphic designer. So
Can we explain vernacular?
yeah, so vernacular is like the language, a common language of common people. So slang is vernacular. Pop art embraces the vernacular. Right? All these benign symbols and words and languages of culture that are not necessarily treated with high regard. Ephemera being ideas and objects that have temporary lifespans. So between vernacular and ephemera, and growing up in the Midwest where Charles Anderson and Sharon Werner rule, the king and queen of ephemera and vernacular, I am bred in this love of vernacular typography, of the ephemeral image, and that's really my roots. And so a lot of my early poster work has a lot of found image, old clip art books, matchbook covers turned into rock posters, that kind of thing. But I also really love the abstract vernacular and ephemeral, and that's where Two Bettys comes into play, because these are stories of ephemerality, of ephemeral moments and vernacular moments of the American existence, the American story. They're collected into these stories of, I think for me the peak is a year in the life of a junk drawer. And that is like it is pure ephemera, vernacular, and the American experience. So when that comes around to you, note the artwork, but the stories are also about ephemeral moments in our lives as well. So October is defined by a packet of hot sauce, and it's called Late Night Rocktober Drive-Through Regret. Right? And because the junk drawer is this archaeological core sample of our daily life. And when we die and those objects live on, the greatest archaeological digs will be in the junk drawer. Right? Every anthropologist and archaeologist in the year 30,000 will hope to find the junk drawer because then they'll be able to understand what human life was like in 2019. So for me, it's actually very important, these ephemeral stories and these small moments, because as history shows us, our best stories are told by our garbage. So Two Bettys for me is an example of the ephemeral and the vernacular that I really love. I also have this object here, which is a book that I self-published in 2008, which is a collection of photographs of misplaced groceries, and then the stories that go with those misplaced groceries. Sometimes the stories are narrative, sometimes the stories are me trying to rationalize why there is American Kraft singles over by the block cheese. Sometimes they make a lot of sense, sometimes they make no sense at all. But they are, for me, another example of what I'm understanding is my style, which is really much more about my point of view. And I can see now, only recently, that style is really just the physical incarnation of the point of view. And my point of view is that these small moments tell us more than we could possibly imagine about ourselves. And these small moments, whether they are vulnerable mistakes that we make in passing that we realize is a better idea than we ever imagined, or whether they are hot sauce in a junk drawer or Kraft singles by the block cheese, they are the ways that I see that we can paint a portrait of our existence. That's what I've been working with for the past 3 years. I think that the style is almost style is the symptom of the point of view.
Yeah.
So like if you have a style, it shouldn't be something that's a contrivance. It should be something that just makes you happy to see. Somewhere deep in that style is your point of view. And it took me 20 years to figure out what my point of view is while working in this style for 20 years. But I mean, I went back and looked at my student portfolio from 1997, and there's stuff in there that is the same. I mean, I made a fictitious modern art brochure using toys from my childhood, like these ephemeral vernacular objects. I also, made fake packaging for gun holsters that looked like they were made in that vernacular of the bottom of a box of nails. So I'm, my point of view hasn't changed, even if my aesthetic style has. Now that I know what I have to say, I can now say it in a bunch of different ways. Through vernacular typography or the ephemera of bowls sitting around the house. And I know that in a classroom, you're asked to try and find your point of view. And I know how hard that is. And that sometimes style is seen as superficial or vapid. But I think it's maybe a symptom of something deeper that just needs more time to come to the surface, to be understood.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thank you.
So that was Dan Ibarra, formerly of Aesthetic Apparatus, currently of Face of the Earth and Thriving Concern. What did you get out of that? If there's one thing that helped kind of illuminate something about the creative process, please leave a comment below. Would love to hear from you. Thanks a lot for watching.